Hey folks, back in the study of the book of James, the study that I've entitled The Immediate Gospel, because of James's challenge to the first century believers that following Christ was supposed to change and challenge their lifestyle. Today we're going to be in chapter 5. This is lesson number 10 out of this book and out of this study, and we'll wrap it up next week with lesson number 11. May do a recap to kind of try to sum it all up and bring James's theme and thoughts together in one simple place. More than likely, when this letter, this epistle was originally written, it would have been read in one sitting to a group of people, and then they probably would have sat around for an hour or a couple of hours afterwards discussing what James had to say. And of course, they would have referred to it multiple times. But sometimes the idea of taking it all in one setting helps us understand his theme and his purpose in his writing. And so today he has once again, it's a kind of an in-your-face, hey, listen up, this is what you're doing, this is what you're supposed to be doing, and this is why you're doing it. And that's one of the key themes of James, is the why that prompts our actions. All of us have a why. We have a purpose, whether it's for school, whether it's for friendships, whatever the situation may be. And if you hold on for a second, I'm going to reach over to this brick wall here and mysteriously find a light switch. But we all have a reason and a purpose behind what we do. And so James is always confronting that in his readers, or for his readers. And so in today's passage, it's the first 12 verses of chapter 5. And we're going to read it here in just a second. But James has a specific goal here, and you're going to see it as I read it, that he's using a contrasting method. He's comparing one style of behavior to another style of behavior. And the first thing he does is he presents the one style, and then he contrasts it with the style of the person who is the follower of Jesus, and says, hey, this is why yours shouldn't be like that, and this is why it should be different, and this is how it should be different. And so we're going to read beginning in verse 1. Now listen, you rich people, weep and wail because of the misery that is coming on you. Your wealth has rotted, and moths have eaten your clothes. Your gold and silver are corroded. Their corrosion will testify against you and eat your flesh like fire. You have hoarded wealth in the last days. Look, the wages you failed to pay the workers who mowed your fields are crying out against you. The cries of the harvesters have reached the ears of the Lord Almighty. You have lived on earth in luxury and self-indulgence. You have fattened yourselves in the day of slaughter. You have condemned and murdered the innocent one who was not opposing you. Be patient then, brothers and sisters, until the Lord's coming. See how the farmer waits for the land to yield its valuable crop, patiently waiting for the autumn and spring rains. You too, be patient and stand firm, because the Lord's coming is near. Don't grumble against one another, brothers and sisters, or you will be judged. The judge is standing at the door. Brothers and sisters, as an example of patience in the face of suffering, take the prophets who spoke in the name of the Lord. As you know, we count as blessed those who have persevered. You have heard of Job's perseverance and have seen what the Lord finally brought about. The Lord is full of compassion and mercy. Above all, my brothers and sisters, do not swear, not by heaven or by earth or by anything else. All you need to say is a simple yes or no. Otherwise, you will be condemned. There are some things that you and I need to understand as we jump into this passage today. And the first thing is that James is pushing back against our natural inclination to accumulate and to look out for ourselves. That is the nature of every individual. It is easy to look at our culture now, at least from a religious and spiritual standpoint, and from a critical standpoint, and say that our culture magnifies this. And that is definitely the case. But every culture since time began has also had the same problem. Go all the way back to the Garden of Eden, go all the way back to Cain and Abel, go back to Noah, go back to any portion of Scripture, any portion of secular history you find recorded, and you will find this to be true. And I mentioned this a few weeks ago, but it's a prevalent thought, and it's a kind of a catchy way to think about this. But we are told that we must get what we can and can what we get and sit on the can. In other words, get everything you can get, keep it for yourself, and make sure you secure it. James is revealing how destructive this behavior is, and it's destructive to everyone. It's destructive to the one who does it, because their hope is in something that's not going to last. It's destructive on those who are surrounding them, because ultimately they are deprived because of the other person hoarding or consuming all of the wealth. And for the believer who tends and trends towards this type of action, it shows a lack of dependence upon God, and it destroys us because we're no longer trusting in who God is and who He says He is. This is so interesting, and I love this passage because as I talk and deal with students and young adults in today's culture, many of them are very aware of how much their culture has dominated the way that we get and consume. And many of you have taken steps to prohibit that in your own life. And many of you talk about living lifestyles. In fact, a word that's used is minimalism or minimalist, or I'm a minimalist, or I try to limit things. And those are great characteristics to begin to develop. I love the idea of some of these tiny homes and things you see popping up. You see vans being repurposed and built into campers and things like that. And it's a beautiful use of the resources that we already have. But we need to be careful in that, because in that we can also turn that into an excessive consumption as well, as we try to get everything that we want and that we desire. And so James begins by addressing the rich. And if you want to understand what rich is, James mentions the rich people multiple times in this book or in this letter. And the rich are essentially this. They're the ones in the mix. They're the ones who are running around in politics, whether it be conservative or liberal. They're the ones who are leading the larger organizations, whether they be good, whether they be religious or secular. They're the ones that are getting thousands upon thousands of views and comments and all these sorts of things, because these are the people that you and I look at and say things like this: they have arrived. We have this vision of people who have gotten everything there is to get and who now find themselves comfortable. One of the thoughts that I have as I even make that statement is there are people who would look at me and say about me, he has arrived. He has a comfortable house. He has a nice place. He works for a good church. He works for a church that supports him and takes care of him financially. His family lives in this place and they attend these schools. And so I have to be careful because I fall into this category. And that's where I go back to just a minute ago how I was saying the idealism of minimalism is great. I think it's a beautiful picture of what we can do with the resources we already have. But we must be reminded that simply because we're buying differently than the culture before us or our generations before us does not mean we're accurately using the resources that we have available to us. So what about these rich people? Well, the first thing I see, and it kind of just rattles me a little bit, is this. Everything that they have, James speaks of it in past tense. Let me read that to you. He says this: your wealth has rotted and moths have eaten your clothes. In other words, what you have and what you are literally counting on is already gone. That's an incredible thought. And so as I thought about this, I want us to think about how that can be the case. Well, the first thing is this. What we value does not exist in the shape that we think it does. In other words, James says, your wealth has rotted and moths are eating your clothes. In fact, a lot of the things that we value don't have any real value outside of the cultural and time frame context in which we live. For example, my cell phone. Love it. I put tremendous value in this phone. But if all of a sudden we were not to have electricity in the U.S. anymore, this thing has no value. If all of a sudden internet was not accessible through Wi-Fi anymore, this thing has no value. And so James is saying the very things that you can think are valuable actually don't have any value at all. So the first thing he points at is that these things are corrupted by the outside elements, all right? Things rot because of the rain and the sun and the heat, the humidity. They rot because they're being consumed by things from the outside. And so It's like buying a new car, and you guys and girls may never have thought about this, but it'll just give you a challenge if you want to know. Go look up what a 2020 model is. Pick a car, a Honda Civic, and maybe it's $23,000 on the lot. And then go look up what a 2019 Honda Civic is with 15,000 miles on it. And you might find out that same Honda Civic that was selling for $23,000 is now selling for $18,000, and it only has 13,000 miles on it. So things are being consumed from the outside. The second consumption is things are being corrupted from within. Then James says, your gold and your silver are corroding. Now, the reason that gold and silver corrode is because they're not pure. There are impurities within the metals that cause them to corrode. And so James says the very things that people count on, their wealth, the things that they are able to hoard and consume, James says they're going to rot away not only from the outside, but they're going to rot away from the inside because they're not as valuable as you think they are. What a challenge. They're not as pure as we think they are. See, for example, I said earlier, I may think I have arrived based on, or other people may think I have arrived based on the house and the home I live in. But I think I live in a very modest home. I think I live in a home that's very simple. So our idea of what is good and what is wealth and what is, it's not as pure as we assume that it is, okay? So what causes this loss? Why is it that their wealth is going to be rotting, and why is it that it's going to consume? Well, James says it's because they're hoarding wealth. He says they are literally withholding wages. They're not paying people in a timely and fair way. Now, young people, this is going to be your challenge. You guys are going to be the ones that are able to challenge this in the culture in which we live. And I think all of you should be seeking to get a skill. All of you should be seeking to work hard. But we need to challenge ourselves in this country as to what it means to pay someone a fair wage. Not what the government says is a fair wage, not what a state says is a fair wage, but what are they actually able to live off of? What is sometimes referred to as a living wage. And I hesitate to use that term because it has a ton of negative connotations with it. But the reality of it is this: what could a person expect to live on making a particular rate of money? All right. So, and by the way, James mentions nothing here about the skill of the employee, but rather the greed of the employer. It's a challenge, okay? The second thing is not only are they hoarding wealth and withholding it from others, but in their very consumption, they are causing death. Now, another challenge for you. I've already mentioned the car challenge. You can go look up the value of a vehicle and you can see what it was valued at brand new and what it's valued at 1 year later with a few miles on it. Well, here's another challenge for you. Why don't you look at where some of our resources are coming from in this country? Why don't you look at where some of the resources are coming from to build things like this iPhone here, or maybe the computer you have, or maybe the tablet you have, or those sorts of things. And maybe consider where those are coming from. And I think you would be shocked to find out they're coming from some very poor places, and lives are potentially being ruined over that. And that's a challenge for us as we consume, that we not consume on the backs of the poor, because it leads to death. I don't know when the last time is you checked out what the price of hamburger meat is in your local grocery store. Probably $3.50 a pound. They're selling hamburgers for $1 a piece in some places. You and I can do the math on that and really quickly consume and understand that some people are going to suffer greatly in making a product that is made and sold that cheaply. So these are the rich. And James speaks harshly against their consumption and against their hoarding. And now he transitions to God's people, the followers of Jesus. And these are the people that James is writing to. These are the folks he is advocating to. And he is saying, if you're a follower of Christ, these are the behaviors you should exhibit. He's cautioning them about how they speak. He's cautioning them about how much they speak. He's cautioning them about showing favoritism, about the way they treat others, and about how they listen to others. I mean, James has been dealing with stuff on every turn as much as he can, or it seems as much as possible. How does he speak to them? Remember, he spoke to the rich as everything in the past tense. It's completely the opposite. It's 180 with this group of people. With this group of people, everything is anticipation. Everything is about hope. And by the way, that's just as scary. It's just as scary to realize that we don't even know. And it seems potentially incorrect. So look what he says here. The follower of Jesus is geared up for hope and anticipation, and these are my words, anticipation is the name of our game. Look what he says. Be patient then, brothers and sisters, until the Lord's coming. See how the farmer waits for the land to yield its valuable crop. This is not means you don't sit back, you don't do anything, say, oh, I'm waiting on God to act. No, this is a farmer who's gone out, he's put seed in the ground, he's probably fertilized it, but now all he can do is wait on rain. He can't bring rain, he can't make it happen, he can simply wait on it. So you and I are called to this faithful anticipation. So in other words, we do things with the belief and the hope that God is going to act. There's an expectation. This is such a challenge for us because a lot of times, especially as we get older and our ages change and our cultures change and the things we want about life change, the tendency is to just kind of get this negativity about us and just be, everything's terrible. James says for a believer, everything is hoping for what's going to come. I mean, it's just this beautiful idea that, a farmer goes out there to his field and he looks at his field and he's just waiting. He knows as soon as the rain hits, that corn's going to go from 6 inches to 30 inches. He knows as soon as the rain hits, that corn that's at 4 feet and has just a few tiny tassels on it is going to just blow up and the ears are going to fill up. He knows that's when it's going to happen. So as a believer in Christ, we're called to the same anticipation, this eager anticipation. And because of that, there's a need for unity. Think about that. The farmers, they're going out there, they know what they're waiting on is rain. So all they're doing is trying to encourage each other. And there's a strong call for us to be encouragers. He says, don't grumble against one another. It's not, if you're talking about in the context of a farmer, it's not his wife's fault that it's not raining. It's not the children's fault. It's not the cow's fault. And so he doesn't need to go around with this attitude trying to bring pain upon everyone else because of his weight. You and I are not supposed to walk around with some attitude because as Christians we're waiting on God to do something that we're anticipating. We're supposed to be generous and kind. And James says here's how you do that. The first thing you do is you look back in history. And you don't look back at history and see people who saw this fulfilled. You look back at history at people who prophesied that it would be fulfilled, and then another generation saw it happen. And that's such a challenge because what he is saying to us is this. He says, go back to the prophets. The prophets were the ones that told the king, hey, this is going to happen. You're going to have a good thing. Things are going to happen well. Things are going to happen bad. But normally those prophets didn't even get to see that come to pass. It was the next generation or the next group of people who saw that come to pass. Think about maybe in your life, you're a young adult or young person. Your parents are telling you, work hard in school, do the best you can, all these sorts of things. And you get this negativity about you and you think, what's it worth? And then you don't realize that three decades down the road, you're going to need that discipline that was put into you. You're going to need that fortitude to fight through things. Maybe when you're working in a career, maybe even in your family life as well. And so we're supposed to have this patience and this expectation. And those things are going to lead us to this. We're going to begin to recite the things that God has done. Now, I want you to think for just a minute. What would it sound like if you and I were to begin to recite the things that God has done? What would it sound like in our country? Now, the tendency is to go back 240 some odd years and say, oh, in the founding of our country, our founding fathers had this ideal. That's great. But don't skip some things. 70 years ago, our country had a major problem with civil rights. We're still dealing with racial inequality. We're still dealing with racial unrest. And to some degree, I think we will for a very long time. But we are light years ahead of where we were. And think about some of the men and women who helped raise that up, who helped bring that about. Go back further than that. I mentioned prohibition a few weeks ago. And we look at prohibition now and say, oh, that was a horrible idea to just completely ban alcohol. At least I say when I say we, people of my generation, it's kind of a mocking thing towards it. But you look at what the drunken rates were prior to Prohibition. You look at some of the things that happened during that time. Then go back another 30 years and look at another time frame and look at another time frame and go back and go back and go back. Because what James is challenging his readers to do is say, hey, you know what? God brought Noah through the flood. Hey, you know what? God brought the Israelites through the Red Sea. Hey, you know what? God brought Joshua through Jericho. Hey, you know what? God brought, and keep naming the things that God has done. Only the goodness of God can bring about. And you and I are called to that. And we can go back, we can start in Genesis and work our way through Scripture, but I would challenge you to keep working yourself through modern history as well, because as a believer, there's supposed to be this expectation of what God is doing and what God is bringing about. He closes this portion with one final challenge. And guys and girls, if you're listening, here's my challenge to you. You and I can become more faithful followers of Christ if we will adopt what James says here. He says, do not swear. Now, he is not speaking about cuss words. He's not speaking about crude words or slang words. What he is talking about here is the desire and the tendency to self-promote and exhibit self-reliance by embellishing our statements, by saying more than we are capable of doing, by over-assuring people, by over-promising to people. James is saying, listen, you're a child of God. Don't belittle yourself. Don't over-promise yourself. Just say yes and just say no. And be simple. Now, you think about this. It's going to get harder as you grow. It's going to get harder as you reach your young adult years, and you're going to get invited to this thing and that thing. And now you have to decide, and instead of saying, I want to go do this, you say, well, you make up these ideas and all these excuses. And people of God are some of the worst about this, especially when we get up on stages. And we think that we just got to make up all these things. Just say yes and just say no. So there's our challenge in the immediate gospel today, is consider the impact of material wealth on our lives. As a believer, be prepared to be patient for God to work. And then as a believer, exhibit these behaviors by being simple in our speech. God bless you. We'll see you next time.